issued a sharply worded advisory opinion holding the International Court of Justice finds that Gaza remains under occupation and that Israel is legally obliged to cooperate with the United Nations agencies to ensure humanitarian aid reaches the territory. In particular, the court found that the blockade and suspension of aid operations violates Israel's international obligations. It cleared the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, of credible evidence or bias or links to Hamas. The ruling comes as a fragile ceasefire holds and as South Africa's genocide case against Israel remains before the same court. With us now is Professor Andre Thomashuizen, who's a Professor Emeritus of International Law at the University of South Africa, to unpack the legal and political implications. Prof, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Good morning, Peter. Good morning, listeners.
So I suppose what we need help with as audiences across the continent is, in essence, what is the court's opinion and what are the key legal findings therein, and why might it be described by some as a rebuke against Israel?
Well, I think for starters, it is important to remember that this is not an ordinary court. There is no enforcement mechanism. The court cannot enforce anything. It is an advisory opinion, and other United Nations organs like the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council are obliged to read it, to take notice, but they're under no obligation to actually implement anything. So it is a statement. It will have a moral, a persuasive authority, but nothing beyond that. In the statement, I find nothing new, because since the ruling of the International Court of Justice on what used to be Southwest Africa, now Namibia, the principle was established that an occupation power, by occupying a territory and its people, assumes a lot of responsibilities. It must be held responsible for the welfare of the people that are being occupied. That, again, is a very wide concept, from the provision of maybe 2 liters of water per day to each person to actual well-being can be a far stretch. That is where this advisory opinion will be criticized, because it simply assumes that Israel is an occupying power in the West Bank, knowing that Israel withdrew completely from the West Bank and handed over all authority in the West Bank to the political organization, later armed political organization Hamas. And this happened a long time ago. And since that time, Israel does not maintain any police stations in Gaza, does not build any roads there, does not provide water, does not provide electricity. So Israel can always argue that it is not an occupying power. It is at war against Hamas, and it is waging war in Gaza, but that doesn't make it an occupying power. So those are the two essentials. The advisory opinion has actually no immediate force and effect, and it rests on an assumption of occupation of Gaza. And I would say any observer, any listener can very easily see that most of Gaza cannot actually be freely entered. It is a war zone. You cannot just take your car and drive into there. So how could Israel be deemed an occupying power?
But isn't going into a territory in war occupation?
Only if you establish effective authority. If you start issuing ID documents, if you start counting the population, if you start running police stations, fire stations, hospitals, whatever. If you just have
so another notable
forces,
finding, though, is that UNRWA has not been shown to have breached its neutrality, contrary to Israeli claims. How significant is that finding for UNRWA's operations and reputation?
Well, it is the ICJ saw fit to rule like that. Most developed nations and the great powers in this world, including China, including Russia, including India, they think otherwise. They have cut the funding to UNRWA, and they have made many findings available that UNRWA was actually an extension of Hamas and was completely infiltrated by Hamas. Be that as it may, the ICJ ruling will not change anything about the status of UNRWA, and it will not make life easier for those people that are promoting UNRWA.
You say that most people believe that it was infiltrated, but where was the evidence in court?
I don't know, maybe people didn't even bother to put evidence before the court because these advisory opinions by the major powers in this world are just considered irrelevant. They also, this entire argument is becoming obsolete with the ceasefire and the envisaged peace agreement, which is endorsed by all great powers in the world and all the regional powers around in that region, around Gaza. It is basically just Iran and South Africa that are continuing to fight a fight which has become obsolete through history. The fighting has ended. People are very seriously working towards a peace agreement, and everything else is history.
If we then say that Israel is not an occupying force in Gaza, does that mean that they're not under any obligation to allow humanitarian aid to reach those in need?
Well, Israel is under the obligation of observing humanitarian law, mainly the Geneva Conventions on how the use of force is conducted, and that includes where their forces control access, that access must be limited to military purposes, and it is under humanitarian obligations not to harm civilian populations. And again, there's a huge debate on fact. Israel has shown aerial photography of hundreds of aid trucks parked, stationed, immobilized at entry points because Hamas doesn't allow them to progress into the territory. Many people driving these trucks and organizing these trucks are refusing to enter the territory because their drivers are at risk of dying. The trucks get stopped and looted. So there is big controversy about the actual facts. I think what we can say is that despite the many alarming worries, there is not a famine in Gaza. And we haven't seen evidence of people that have died of hunger, contrary to, for instance, Somalia or Sudan, where you see people with a body weight below 50 kilograms that look like skeletons. There's no such evidence from Gaza.
I wonder, how does this latest opinion affect the South African genocide case against Israel? Might it influence this case before the same court?
Probably the court is indicating, it is showing an inclination to be harsh or to be tough on Israel, or not to accept Israel's lines of argument or defenses, and that could weigh in favor of the genocide application that is led by South Africa. There is, however, the risk that the court will be forced to declare the whole matter moot when it finally decides on the genocide matter, because it is not the court's obligation to rule on history, to rule on past things. The application was to prevent a genocide from happening, and if there is no evidence that any genocide is currently happening, then whatever happened in the past might be irrelevant before the court. So let us see when the court sees fit to set a date for a further hearing or to pronounce a ruling.
Okay, so perhaps in the court of public opinion it has a different effect, but on the ground in reality, this advisory unlikely to change anything that's been happening and change Israel's behavior.
I think it is an important reminder to Israel that there are international norms, and international norms will influence the perceptions, the views of countries, and the way they interact with Israel. So, if a country is found to be violating humanitarian law, then that will, of course, affect its diplomatic status and its ability to interact with other countries and to be respected. And the goodwill of a country is the good name of a country is important. But tangible, precise consequences, I see none. And that is in the nature of the International Court of Justice. It is a bit like a moral court. It is not a court as we know it in our national legal system.
Professor, we're going to have to leave it there, but your thoughts, insights, always greatly appreciated on the program. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. It is a pleasure.
That was Professor Andre Thomashuizen, who's a Professor Emeritus for International Law at the University of South Africa, sharing his thoughts on the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on Israel's continuing obligations in Gaza. He says they're at war, they're not an occupying force, therefore those obligations are not the same.